Good evening, and welcome to this Center for Brooklyn History talk. Thank you for joining us at this moment when we're all watching history unfold in these United States. Tonight we focus on what is ultimately the most important topic for our country right now: race, racism, and white male rage, in a discussion about the new book, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. Before introducing our guests, let me introduce myself and tell you just a little bit about the Center for Brooklyn History. I'm Marcia Eli, Director of Programs at the Center, which is a part of the Brooklyn Public Library. Every week, we offer free programs like this one through the library's programming arm, BPL Presents. We have many topical evenings coming up. In the next few weeks, we'll be discussing fascism, the relationship between Iran and America. And then at the end of January is BPL Presents Always Provocative Night of Philosophy and Ideas. So I hope that you'll explore, and I hope that you'll join us. Mediocre asks the question, what happens to a country that tells generation after generation of white men that they deserve power over people of color, women, and every other human being? It's books like this and conversations like tonight's that maybe, just maybe, help to inch us towards change. In a minute, I have the honor of introducing author Ijeoma Oluo and her conversation partner, Jay Smooth. But first, I want to tell you a few quick things. First, I want to share that we have arranged to allow you to buy the book locally at the community bookstore in Brooklyn. And when you get your email tomorrow, thanking you for coming to this program, there will be a link to purchasing it at the community bookstore. Second, I want to share that those of you who are joining us on Zoom can use the caption function, which is at the bottom of your screen, that you can enable by clicking there. And finally, I want to invite all of you to share your questions for Ijeoma and Jay. Simply type them into the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And now it's my great pleasure, truly, to welcome Ijeoma Oluo, the author of the best-selling book, So You Want to Talk About Race, and the new, frighteningly timely work, Mediocre, and Jay Smooth, pioneering hip-hop blogger and radio host, best known for his commentary on race and politics at the Ill Doctrine video blog. Thank you both so much for being here. I turn it over to you.
All right, microphone check, 1, 2. Thank you so much for having us. And it feels strange to say it's a pleasure to be talking to you tonight, Ijeoma, but I can't think of a better night for us to be connecting for this
Yeah,
conversation.
absolutely. I feel like this is like I feel like this is something like we would be in DMs like what's happening right now? Did you see this? So
Right.
actually having this
We
conversation.
would, yeah, this would be the group chat.
Yeah.
And I said in one of my videos a long time ago that being black in America is being in a constant state of being shocked but not surprised. And I don't think that's ever been more true than today, watching all of this play out, at once so pathetic and so dangerous, and at once so utterly mind-boggling, while being completely, it literally couldn't be more predictable. And as I watched all of this play out, especially the way that the authorities are dealing with it, what I first took as a lack of preparedness from the police and the Department of Defense, I couldn't fathom why they'd be so unprepared. And I had to come back to a refrain from your book, Works According to Design, and consider whether Occam's razor points to this is not a lack of preparedness. They prepared precisely to let this happen. And we are seeing things work according to design. So I'm wondering what of the many thoughts I'm sure come to mind have been at the forefront as you watched all this.
It's really weird because I feel like part of me, it's almost an out-of-body experience, where there's a part of you that's horrified, and then a part of you that's like, this is the most ridiculous episode of television I've ever seen in my life. You know, like, are you kidding me? You know, it's so final form. You know, I was thinking this morning, and I was thinking about like the book and how many times people have asked me in just the 1 month since the book came out of, would you have updated it? What would you put in it now? And I'm like, look, all of this tracks, like you look at it and you're like, okay, it's absurd, but how absurd? In what sense? Like, this is what we knew was going to happen. It's like the most collective, violent, dangerous collective fit that's being thrown, like at the White House, you know, grown ass men, you know, kicking in windows because their dude, you know, lost their favorite game, you know, and it's just, it's, you know, it's weird. And then also, right, with the cops, you're like, oh, okay, so this is like it ends up being this weird family reunion where it's like baddies against baddies. Like, what's gonna happen in here? And looking at the commentary right now, I was just looking at the news. I don't know if you saw this, but they were on, like, there's so many reassurances that the National Guard coming in isn't armed.
Oh,
And they're like, oh, they're not armed. And then the ones after that, they won't be armed either. And they won't be armed. And they won't be armed. And they won't be making arrests. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. So, like, that's different, you know, considering, like, they're not even armed with non-lethal things, apparently. They're coming in, like, without pepper spray, I guess, or whatever. And like, cool, okay, so they're observers. I don't understand, you know. And I mean, and I am against police violence. It's just hilarious, the messaging
yeah,
that's
but perhaps we shouldn't see them taking selfies with each other.
perhaps this isn't the time, you know. But then again, you know, it also, you know, it's this weird full circle of reminding me of like white women at the marches against Trump taking selfies with cops at the same time. Like, I feel like there's this whole like, oh, okay, so there's a whole spectrum of like mediocre whiteness that's really great with cops right now.
And it speaks to something else that runs throughout your book, which is how incredible it is to have such a sense of being oppressed while everything is so heavily tilted in your favor. They're getting the most privileged possible treatment as they carry on this tantrum, and yet they feel as if the system is against them in this.
Yeah, I know. Can you imagine like being like, I'm so oppressed while breezing past officers to get to federal government buildings and taking it over and breaking in windows and, you know, tearing it apart and pepper spraying police, apparently. Like, I don't, how, like, okay, where is that great? But that's what it is, right? Because the truth is you still have to build that narrative. And I think like what we're seeing, and what I definitely saw with the book too, is like how strong that narrative has to work. And, you know, of course, Trump is going to start his talk that's supposed to calm things down by stoking up that entire narrative of victimhood and abuse and oppression. Because of course he doesn't actually want this to calm down. He doesn't want this to stop. And this is going to be his legacy, right? The thing that he's going to continue to use to drive power and distraction and what he needs. But it's just, to see it all happen. I just would have loved to have a few more hours to celebrate Georgia. That would have been cool. That would have been really great. I woke up this morning like itchy about it, like, oh, like I'm happy a little about a political news. I feel, you know, and I even tweeted about it, and later someone was like, wow, this didn't age well. It had been 1 hour.
Right, but that's the historical pattern that we might not even need to go over, of every little bit of progress brings this
Mhm.
massive backlash, going back to Reconstruction and so on and so on and so on.
Which is true. And that's actually why, you know, as I think what's really interesting to me is seeing the racial divide in reaction to what's happening right now. Because, you know, someone asked me, are you scared about what's happening? And I said, well, I'm always scared. Am I more scared now than I was yesterday? No. And people saying, oh, this took away from the achievement in Georgia. No, this is the backlash to the sorts of achievements and the work and the organizing. This is par for the course. Like, I don't think anyone, you know, I don't think Stacey Abrams or, you know, I don't think anyone is surprised and going, I wasn't expecting white dudes to be angry. This has been building for a long time. This is what happens anytime we make progress, right? So it's a weird thing the way it's hitting me, because it's not hitting me like this big shock. It's not hitting me in this way that's like increasing my fear any more than the fear I've had knowing of how many armed militias we have around this country already. And, you know, knowing the history of this country, and, you know, knowing that, you know, of course, white men are going to think, after they were allowed to take over a federal building in Oregon for a month, of course they know they can go into any building pretty much if their politics are convenient to people in power, and it'll be fine. So it's a weird space where it's like I'm watching it, and yeah, at some point, in some level, it's mind-boggling and weird, and some level, you're like, yeah, okay, yeah, so this is what happens. But of course, it doesn't mean I'm not concerned. Like, every one of these is an opportunity where white supremacy is trying to entrench itself, white male supremacy is trying to consolidate and hold on and push back against any progress we make. And so the response to this matters.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What are you seeing right now? Because I'm really hoping they actually do continue with the process tonight, and there have been people pushing for it. I think that that's an important message that needs to be sent.
Yeah, I'm definitely hoping they'll follow through with the process. I'm very curious to see whether these Republicans will continue with their airing of grievances, or will they finally now go along with the process.
Yeah,
My hopes are not high that they will rise to the occasion.
I know.
Um,
I know.
but I keep thinking, watching this play out, that you've spoken about one of the inspirations for this book being wanting to get away from the pattern we're always stuck in of reacting to these individual instances of white male supremacy rearing its ugly head, and finding some space to look at the patterns, the history, the systems that are behind this ugly head that keeps on rearing. So I'm wondering what are the historical parallels you see in what you see playing out today, and some of the things you explored in the book that resonate with it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, like, right now, if there's one thing that the book, you know, shows over and over again, and even especially as I was researching it, which was, you know, brutal a lot of the time,
I
is
have to
just
imagine.
how people need to understand that when we're talking about the best interests of these people, right? Because a lot of times we say, why are these white men against their best interests? Even right now, people are like, oh, they're against democracy. Of course, always have been. Their best interests are defined differently, right? So their best interest is still, and always will be, the perceived power over people who aren't white men. And that means, and the violence, they will burn everything down for that. Everything down for that, because that's really all they think they can accomplish in this society. And we've seen this time and time again, and we saw this, you know, in the post-Reconstruction terror, right? Where, you know, the South literally, the white South burned itself to the ground and doomed itself to multiple generations of poverty, because it was mad that it didn't have this semblance of power over Black people, and it would rather burn itself down than actually build, you know, an economy that didn't rely on this exploitation of Black people. And, you know, we've seen this throughout, you know, the riots in Red Summer, where, you know, we saw whole cities burned to the ground. And we've seen this with, you know, we saw the fits that were thrown even with the Bundy brothers, and watching that destruction, and this, you know, this fit that, you know, these guys weren't getting everything they wanted, and having that sense of, you know, that they could operate with impunity. And so looking at this, it doesn't surprise me, because they don't actually want a functioning democracy. That's a threat to their power. What they want is what people told them democracy would bring, which was power, right? And if that's not it, then they're going to tear it all down. And they know, because we glorify this sort of violence, and always have. White male violence of this sort we have glorified. These are patriots to the way in which we talk about America. This is patriotism in the way we talk about America. And I mean, even when we look at, you know, Trump's daughter posting, calling them patriots.
Calling them American patriots.
Yes. You
And
know, and
mind you, and this ties into your chapter about football in the book, Colin Kaepernick kneeling while while the national anthem plays is an affront to our flag. Today, we saw these people scale the wall of the Capitol and try to take down the American flag and replace it with the Trump flag. And
yeah,
Ivanka Trump called them American patriots.
absolutely. And it's just the well, because, but that's the thing where we look at, the one thing that's really interesting, if you read Ashley Jardina's book, White Identity Politics, is she talks about how American and like white identities, especially white male identities, go in flux and trade places. And that when nothing is challenged, then white people just think of themselves as American. But when there's a challenge, then it becomes about race. Or when America starts to differ from whiteness and manhood, then suddenly their sense of identity is so much stronger and it becomes something that's activated. So it becomes this kind of dormant, terrifying, right? It shouldn't be dormant that you're consistently thinking that your race and gender is America. That shouldn't be a benign thing that you don't verbalize on a good day, right? But it also means that on a bad day, you get to violently offend, bring it up, and you have this like reserve of racism and sexism that you can pull up the moment that America moves away from this kind of unspoken identity. And so it doesn't surprise me, and we see this throughout history, and we even see this looking at like the Bundy brothers, especially, and looking at what we have, this history of like Mormon fundamentalism, which is people who often in the beginning, when they came to the Utah areas, didn't consider themselves part of America, right? But yet America was theirs. And there's that same white male violence, and they would clash with other white Americans who felt like it was theirs. And seeing that, and then seeing in this present day, and this combination, this coming together of like fundamentalist white male Mormons with anti-government militias, white supremacist groups, actually all working together for the same goal, which is to maintain the violent autonomy and power of white men at all costs. And how they all call it America. Even the anti-federal groups, even the anti-American groups, they all call it America. Is just, it's fascinating because it is in no way like the language, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, like Jay, it's like as Black people, no one says America is you and however you decide it suits you, right? To be an American, if you are anything other than a white man, is to live up to a certain ideal, to earn your way to be able to call it, to have a certain level of success and emulation, and then you might be able to call yourself American. But white men can literally tear down the American flag and it's considered an American act, and we celebrated it throughout history. And it's just, but it explains, like when I'm driving around and someone has an American flag like on their car, I feel unsafe. It's a good signal. I'm dealing with someone who thinks their identity and this myth are one and the same.
Yeah, it's really crossed over from where I would find it ambiguous to where I'm rolling my window up.
Mm-hmm. We went on a road trip, me and the boys, and Gabriel. We go every couple of years, and we had to talk to them as we're driving throughout the West, because a lot of people don't understand. I'm sure a large portion of the people right now in DC came from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. Like this is the heartland of violent white male supremacy. And for the kids, who grew up in the Seattle area, and if you stay within, like, let's say a 30 mile space, you feel like you're in this kind of liberal, safe spot. You go outside of that, it's a totally different story. And trying to explain to the kids what to look for when we're driving, who not to, like, hey, you see this on a car, you see this Confederate flag on a car, you see any sort of flag attached to a car that's like actually waving in the wind. Like, these are not good signs. These are not people, if we're stuck on the side of the road, that we talk to. These are not, like, we can't. And I know that it sounds extreme, but no, you're protecting your kids. And people don't understand, like, you know, what it's like. And for the kids to understand why, what it means, and, you know, who don't see a Confederate flag on a regular basis, to know the moment we start getting outside the city, it's everywhere. And, you know, it's terrifying. And, you know, sometimes it'll be a cop with a Confederate flag tattoo. And, you know, then they're, you know, and you're trying to explain all these different levels. But we're trying to, quote unquote, enjoy America, right? And drive them through to have this experience, to have these regular conversations about what to look for, who not to approach. You know, I remember driving up to gas stations and being like, yo, this is not the one. And we have to go to a different one, even if we're running low on gas, because this doesn't look like a safe space. And that's America, you know? And that's what we're seeing right now, are, you know, is the stoking of it. And we saw, you know, when I stopped writing about the Bundy brothers, that chapter stuck with me the most, just because it's my backyard, right? Because literally, they are affiliated with, like, the groups that swatted our house. There are members, like, they have similar members, same members. And I stopped writing right as, of course, the pandemic was happening, and looking at the eagerness, because I still keep up with them, the eagerness with which they embrace the anti-mask movement. Because right, like, I don't know if you followed, like, the news stories, but literally the Bundy brothers are being, like, pulled out of government buildings and kids' soccer games because they're protesting and staging these anti-mask protests. This is their big thing, right? This is all tyranny to them. And, you know, then it was, you know, Stop the Steal and all this. And, like, they're just so eager to start this confrontation that they feel like they'll win, because this mythology is built, you know, that, you know, you will conquer this great evil, and the evil is us. The evil is, you know, it's just, yeah, it's not surprising, but it's terrifying.
Right. And that's one of the things I appreciated most in the book, is how you connect the dots historically of getting white men and white people generally to buy into this myth of white male supremacy that has always been fictional and has been entrenched specifically over history by white men who in real life were actually mediocre, creating a mythology around themselves of greatness that they never actually had. And I was especially struck by the part about, was it Buffalo Bill Cody? Is that, there's a lot of white guys named Bill in the frontier days. But yeah, Buffalo Bill Cody, who, just like President Trump, was able to become this demagogue, tyrant, cult of personality by creating a fictional version of himself on this show, The Apprentice, which NBC allowed to run throughout his pursuit of the birther movement, by the way. Shout out to Rashad Robinson from Color of Change, who was the first one I heard point that out. But he was able to entrench this mythological version of himself in people's minds, and people bought into that so much that they went into the voting booth thinking they were voting for that guy from The Apprentice. And it's wild how much of a parallel there is with people like Buffalo Bill Cody, who went out on the road performing a show about the great Buffalo Bill Cody, which was nothing like what he had actually done in his life.
Right. Yeah. Like, yeah, it's just, and I'm curious too, looking at, you know, you look as a writer and you're like, what is this going to look like in history? Because so many people say, oh, this is going to look horrible in history. But the truth is, you know how many people have emailed me saying they had no idea any of these things about Buffalo Bill Cody? They had no idea any of these things, that any of the other white men in the book. So the question is then, how is this going to actually look in history? You know, it's going to depend on how we push back and how we monitor the media, and how hard we actually fight this battle, right? To continue to fight for freedom and for justice. Because if we back off, then their story is one of victory, right? That gets to go into these history books. And also whether or not we allow a redemption arc for anyone involved in this, right? Because even where it's acknowledged that Bill Cody was wrong, he got to have his own redemption arc. He got to say, oh, you know, I've grown and changed, and And we allowed that without any semblance of justice, without any accountability. And I can already see on the left, in the center left, this idea that we're going to immediately open the door to redemption for people that's
Yes,
completely
look
unheard.
forward, not backwards.
Right? Yeah.
There, there's a mob getting ready to trample you. We might need to keep looking backwards.
Right. Yeah. And it's just, I think that we need to recognize, like, we are the historians right now. So the way that we talk about this right now is going to be what we learn and how we move forward. And do we want the history books to say this happened and it didn't matter? Because that's really what happens when we say, let's just move forward and act like it didn't happen. We're saying it didn't matter. We're saying the lives lost didn't matter, that the threat to marginalized populations didn't matter. The threat to democracy didn't matter. When we say that, we can just brush it under the rug, that it's more important that we move forward and negotiate with people who will, then every time they have the opportunity, not only throw us under the bus, but throw our entire democracy under the bus, then we're really saying our democracy doesn't matter, and I hope that we recognize this, like history is being written right now. And yet people talk about it as if the history is going to magically write itself in a favorable way and we don't have to do anything about it. Like they're going to be the baddies in the history books. Well, how? Like someone's going to magically, look at what the reporting that we're not doing about this, the questions we're not asking, the accountability we're not having, the honest discussions we're not having. We're writing that history right now. We're determining how people are going to look at it.
Yeah, and that's more poignant than ever now that so much of this country is locked in on their own alternate reality, alternate understanding of how to discern what is real, what a fact is, whether the concept of a fact matters. How do you think we navigate that going forward?
That's the thing that was interesting to me. One of the things I'm so grateful for, when I was in college, I had this professor, my degree's in political science. I had this professor who had this standing assignment every day that we were to read like 3 newspapers and read these sections of the newspaper, local events, international events in the economy paper section. And we were supposed to read it and pull apart what looked like factual data, what looked like opinion. And we were supposed to do this for like the whole section because you never knew which part she was going to ask you about. And then we would talk about it and people would say, oh, well, here's a fact. And we'd be like, well, is it really? Let's look at some additional sources. And it actually got us looking with a critical eye as to how you can verify what a fact is. The truth is we don't really have strong media literacy in this country. And there's blame all around, right? There is absolutely, I would say, you know this because you've been in media service for a long time, that when papers and news sources couldn't adjust to the .com age, it definitely put a strain on like the practice of journalism
And
when no one's getting paid.
well,
Yeah. And, and for a while, everyone thought they could, make some money off of clicks and have these headlines. And that's what would, whatever drew eyeballs would draw money. But infotainment became this huge thing. But to act as if, first of all, journalism in the United States has always been above is wrong. But the truth is that there was an expectation that you could at least find data to back up what you were saying. And there isn't. And of course, we have this huge diversification of media, which is really vital. But we haven't actually talked about, how media, there aren't very few like everyday lessons on how media has functioned over time, how it has erased and rewritten history, how to check multiple sources for things, what it means to play into someone's confirmation bias, how to be aware of that. And those are conversations we absolutely have to be having, because I see it in writing. I see other people writing things and I'm like, wow, you didn't think like that was such a perfect stat for you, and you didn't think to pause and read and make sure it came from a good space. Like that opinion fits so perfectly into what you wanted it to say, and you really think the world is that easy. Like maybe we need to take a look at this. And we don't. But also at the same time, we have to actually want the truth. And I think that part of the bigger problem is And part of what, my book, I think, even shows is that people don't actually, a lot of people don't want to know what's really happening. People can look, and we've seen this in the last 4 years. It's been very blatant what's been happening, and people don't want to know. There's so much information out there. So then what do we talk about as a society to get people to actually want to know the truth, to get people invested? And I think that means is we have to really talk about power in this country and our goals and what success actually looks like and how toxic and harmful our ideals as a country really are, and redefine that. Because if we don't, there's really, like, I'm just shouting in the wind. We all are, at this point. I'm trying to activate at least people who know something's wrong, but people really don't want to actually learn these things that would challenge, and they don't want to find uncomfortable truths because they shouldn't have to. And I think that that's one of the things that, like, white male supremacy, especially in like what is one of the laziest democracies in the world, in the US, is this whole country has been built with the fact that you don't actually have to research anything. You can, it's one of, it's quite a great privilege to be a white person who can vote in this country, to be a white man who can vote in this country, and feel like no matter what, the candidates are going to reflect your interests. You don't actually have to look at what they are. They know they're going to have to say the things you want to hear. You don't actually have to look at the downstream effects of everything, because you will be the last to suffer from them. You don't have to listen to other people. You don't have to consider the needs that other people might have. Yours are all that matter. And it's incredibly dangerous, and violent, and leads to this. But that means that we have to start defining different, we have to have different goals. We have to define community differently, and that's lofty. I'm hoping to just get enough people to do it that we can outnumber the people that won't, right? And that we can actually see the real danger in it. It's not even so much like, I think the numbers are there. We have plenty of people who think this is wild. Like, people watching news right now, I do think the majority of the country is going, what? Oh my goodness. But do they think it's as big of a threat to their life? Do they define the people who will be harmed by what's at risk as community and friends and family enough to try to make sure that this stops and doesn't happen again? That's the biggest question. And I think, like, all of this, our media, no one's going to demand accurate media. No one's going to care what's happening in Black and brown neighborhoods if we don't start talking about, how we define ourselves and power and what we're invested in this country.
So, on a positive note, which I want to make some space for, we did last night see the fruits of a great deal of labor by especially primarily Black organizers getting out the Black vote. There are a lot of races where there are 100 different factors that the experts say you should consider, but it's been clear across the board that the number crunchers say the Black vote was phenomenal, and that's what turned the tide. And that is thanks to women, including Stacey Abrams, Tamika Atkins, Rebecca, a whole community of people out there putting in that work. So what lessons do you think we can take from the victories that we had last night, that I do think we should, even in
Yeah,
the
I
chaos,
think a
make some
couple of
space
things.
for?
One, I think it's really important for, if you're a Black person, a person of color in this country who feels really, if you're feeling scared or discouraged, to recognize that Black people in Georgia had every reason to feel discouraged, right? The election was actually legitimately stolen. And once again, they were disenfranchised in a region where they are repeatedly disenfranchised over and over and over and over again. And still, they knew they could do something about it. And they were going to try and come together and recognize the power that they had, and that we all have that we come from a long line of that. We shouldn't have to, right? So, like, that frustration, that exhaustion, the heartache, even knowing, like, our bit of celebration over what happened in Georgia is interrupted once again by the violence of white male mediocrity. It shouldn't have to, but knowing we still have that, and it doesn't roll back what we did, I think is vital. But also, I hope that white people watching this realize, like, you could stand to do a little more. Like you could buck up, like you really can. And that we have it. You're human beings like us. Like there is this whole idea that Stacey Abrams is magic, that Black women are magic, that these organizers are magic. No, we've built up the strength, right? That you build when you realize that this matters and you're going to keep doing the work and you're going to learn from your mistakes and come back, that you're in it for the long haul, that you have no other choice. And I need white people to understand that they can survive pushback, that they can still keep fighting for justice, even if what they're seeing in DC scares them, that they can go when the odds are against them, because the odds are against us far more, and keep pushing, and that you can get success. And in fact, we'll all get it a lot quicker if other people decided to join us in that. And I hope that people look at that and recognize. And also I hope that people recognize, because every time there is a severe backlash, and there always will be, right? Trump was a backlash. The election of Trump was a backlash. There is this idea of like, oh, let's back off a bit to appease this anger. To recognize, if you look through history, and even if you're like reading my book, that backlash will always come. And the question is do we keep pushing? Or do we back off and try to start all over again and face the exact same backlash in a few years? So I hope people understand, like, you can still push. And you will get through this, like we have gotten through this. And that, you really don't have a choice if you say that you believe in justice in this country.
Yeah, and that ties right into the question I want to leave us on before we take questions from the audience, which I'm definitely excited to see. And that's we've heard so much over these last 4 years, and after the outcome of this election, as complete as that outcome is now, we've heard from many people that now needs to be a time for listening and healing to the sorts of people we've been talking about who are in the throes of that white male supremacy and are all in on that mythology, even though it is to their own detriment as much as anyone else's. And, for many, including myself, it's been pretty hard to conceive of finding a time for listening and healing when we're dealing with the reality that we're watching play out today. So I'm wondering how do we thread the needle of dealing with that reality and doing the work that you lay out in the book of the need to envision a world that includes re-envisioning what white manhood is. Finding a version of white manhood that I'm reading from the book is not based in the oppression of others, creating a new, healthier version of white identity so that it is not on a suicide mission as it currently is. Like how do we navigate? Like what are we doing?
Yeah. So a couple things I would say. One is, like, if you're not white, this isn't necessarily your work, right? Like, whiteness is to have a conversation, and whiteness in general, regardless of your gender, because the truth is that white women, many white people, regardless of gender, are heavily invested in white male power and are enabling it to a degree that we can't. And that's a conversation that needs to be had there. I would say for us, it's about the systems. It's about saying, okay, we are going to do what we can systematically to limit the damage that this can do. And that is vital. And we have to do that because even though this book is about the dangerous legacy of white male America, in how we deal with this, we have to affirm the humanity and the worth of people harmed by white male supremacy, and saying it's not necessarily about creating kinder, gentler white men. If that's your thing, cool. It's about undoing the harm that's done to people who've been told time and time again they matter less. And that means that we look at the systems. And so we push forward. But I would say in that, if you love white men, and I'm not, I'll say the cliche thing. I have white men in my life I love. What does it look like to love white men? What does it mean to love someone who thinks that they are only successful if they have their boot on someone's neck? What does it mean to love them? Not fear them, not enable them, but to love them. And so if you love white men in your life and you want better for them, then you need to start having serious conversations. If these were my children, my children are men, young men. So as far as patriarchy, I see a lot of things coming for them, and the idea that they can't grow and change is not an idea based in love. And so when we look at like how we are treating people, and the conversations that white people need to be having in their families, in their churches, in their communities, in their workplaces, needs to stem from the fundamental belief that white men can grow and change, that they can have different values, that they will survive it. And if you do that, then we can push forward a lot faster. I want people to understand the innate pessimism around the way in which we talk about that. Even the way in which we talk about the people in DC right now, they actually will not die if their dude isn't president next month. They will be okay. And I know they will, because that's what happens. Like, they have the ability to grow and change, find different ways to try to accomplish political goals, to make sure they're represented. We have to actually believe that they can, and white America has to believe they can, and start behaving accordingly. But that means also, and this is something that I've noticed, what are you asking them to sign on to, right? We can't just say, and I think that this is a problem that often a lot in the white left has, is you can say, disavow this, we are not this. But very rarely do you hear people saying, this is what we actually are. And even right now, we're hearing people say, this isn't us, this isn't America. Oh, well, then what are you? And that's the thing. If you want people to sign on to something, what are they going to sign on to? So what is your new definition of success? You know, what is your new definition of community? What are the values you're actually going to start teaching and rewarding? You're going to have to make that decision, and that means you're going to have to consciously divorce from these harmful norms and add new things. But in the meantime, we have to change our systems. And that has to happen whether or not white men want to come along or not. You know, we have to do that because we are worth more than that.
Hmm. Indeed. And on that note, I want to open it up to some questions from our audience, who I deeply appreciate spending this time with us, with everything that is going on in the world. It's good to be with some good people trying to figure these things out. And the first question that jumps out at me, because there was something I had in my mind already to ask, was this book talks about the mediocrity of white men, but I'm interested in your thoughts on the white woman, specifically the Karens of the world, who are historically insecure and who have felt the need to lie and have cost people their lives. And that's something I was thinking about reading through the book, is how that's, other than state actors like the police, on an interpersonal level, I think the most prominent form of white male supremacy in the public consciousness has been white women in the form of Karens, which is clearly a legitimate phenomenon that we just saw play out here in New York. But we don't always see a lot of discussion that places it in the bigger context of white male supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know, I think that was the interesting thing, that when I was writing the book, that I was, going back and forth on. Like, I think that it's very clear throughout that, like, white women are present and participating, but in talking about the power structure, what they're supporting is white male power, right? And they need to be held accountable to that, and that's a discussion we absolutely need to have. What I don't, what we have, and what I think working on this book made me realize even more than ever, is that there is no women's liberation as long as systemic racism is allowed to exist, because white male supremacy requires the subjugation of women and people of color. And you can't say, and many white women think they can say, my liberation is mine alone and this race thing is separate, as if white male supremacy just vanishes the moment that white women make any advances, when they're still pulling so much strength and so dependent on continued anti-Blackness, especially, and anti-indigeneity in this country. And what I see then is this deal that many white women have made, where they're, and this is also a similar deal to what many white men have made. Many white men know they're pretty powerless in their political system. They're pretty powerless in their economic system. Their proximity to power is how much, they can keep the wheels running and keep people below them. White women have made a very similar bargain, except for their proximity of power is how much they can stay tied to the power that white men are able to get at our expense and at their expense. And I think that white women have to sit and say, okay, what is actual liberation? And if you think you can define liberation in any way that is not intrinsically tied to anti-racism, you're not going to get it. And I saw that time and time again. And in every bit of history we look at, white men are going to react just as violently to white women if they approach true liberation as they have to us. So I think that this deal that many white women have made, it's really binding them to their own oppression and ours. And we need to be, we need to have that honest conversation. And I think, like, for as a Black woman, it's important for me to be able to recognize and say, you are actually not here for liberation, and you're not here for mine. And that means I don't actually have to always compromise and hold space for people who are trying to actually build my continued oppression into their idea of liberation.
Another question that I had in mind when I saw that we were going to speak, what was your emotional experience like writing this book, if you're willing to discuss that? And I was thinking about that, especially knowing that you must have written most, if not all, of this book while trying to survive this pandemic, which is itself a product of white male supremacy and the incompetence and malign neglect that it allows.
Oh yeah, no, it was so awful. I started working on this book the winter of 2018.
Okay.
And
Oh,
so
that's right. Yeah, because I remember when you first told me about it. That's right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then
At
went
dinner
through,
with Mama Smooth. Shout out to Mama Smooth.
yes. Went through 2019. We were, and we were, squatted and dog squad. I was actually like working on the book itself. So that was really traumatic to have this space where like my home was taken over, my work was taken over. And then the pandemic hit, and it was almost impossible, like really. Because you're already on high alert. When you're reading and recognizing once again how violently hostile so many areas of this country are to your very existence. And then actual people, like the community you would depend on, can also be a source of harm, is, horrific. And then of course, June hit, May and June, and I just fell apart, like absolutely fell apart. It was really, really tough. But at the same time, I'd sit there bawling, looking at the news, worrying about people losing colleagues to COVID, having, friends who were being pepper sprayed. We had, everything happening at the occupation here in Seattle. And then going, oh, okay, now I need to find this particular genocide in history, and make sure my dates are correct, but at the same time, it also means, I can see a history of so many Black people who've done this work and who are also doing this work right now. And that it is, for me, then it became, so if you're a Black person picking up this book, are you going to get pain and trauma, or are you going to get validation? And that's where, I had to keep focusing, like, that this is not just a record, but it is a validation for every, Black person who was told that this isn't a big deal, that this isn't part of a pattern. And it is, and putting in context that time and writing the pattern out, and recognizing, and I had to keep reminding myself that's what I was doing. That's really what helped me, get through it. But I wouldn't recommend it. I don't want to do it again.
So another question, can you speak to how toxic masculinity plays into being part of the foundation of racism? When I used that wording, I feel like folks want to hide from that. I'm a white trans guy, so I tend to notice how fiercely people are trying to protect a system of white male dominated culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's our whole history, right? The definition of, I think, there's a thing that happens. Now, granted, of course, we are not the only country who has toxic masculinity. That is a global phenomenon. But the ways in which it's tied to white supremacy in this country is unique. And this country that's like put together and tied together, held together by extreme racist and sexist violence. A country born that way, that maintains that narrative, feels it has to maintain power that way. And it actually probably does have to maintain power that way. And so there are so many different ways in our history that we have always glorified this sort of violence. And, throughout the book, it was coming up time and time again. We look at muscular Christianity. We look at the birth of football, right? The whole sport, founded because white men were afraid that they wouldn't have their sons wouldn't have the physical power to maintain the land that they had violently stolen from people of color, right? And looking at this response too of, what they thought was the feminizing of arts and culture when women started becoming popular novelists and playwrights, and the violent response that had to come and these dime store novels and things like that to push back. It is all about the definition of white manhood. And the definition of white manhood in America is one of conquer, right? So you build this story of violent white men, right? Of savage native peoples that then of violent black men and savage native peoples that then white men conquer nobly. And their strength is derived by that story. And so, toxic masculinity is at the core of this, but it's how you maintain these systems of power. It's how you keep people invested in it and stopping people from seeing the inherent cruelty and dehumanization, not only for women and people of color and people who aren't men, but also for white men themselves, right? How divorced from their own humanity they are expected to be. You can't, and of course, people have problems with the term. People have problems with any term that gets to the point, and it's not the term. It's not, you can name it whatever you want, and people are gonna have problems with whatever helps, shed light on, some unfavorable truths.
So, a question that ties into a particularly juicy chapter of the book, in my opinion. What do you think white male allyship should look like right now?
People had so much fun with that chapter. I feel like there's like this kind of inside baseball around that chapter where people who've worked in certain areas, spent time in certain areas, or knew who I'm talking about, getting these messages and they're like, oh my God. And also like that chapter, the first chapter talking about these old ass white feminists from back in the day. It was hilarious because so many people were like, wow, these guys seem like dudes I've met today. And that's actually why I wrote that too, because I just stumbled upon a sentence in my research and was like, oh gosh, this sounds so like guys I know. I need to know more. What I think is really important, first and foremost, is that white men need to do the work on themselves, right? So they need to first know how our systems work, educate themselves and actually know how they work, not how it just works for them, but how it works for people who aren't them. They need to understand the world that they're in because they've been allowed the luxury of not actually having to know how the sausage is made. And they need to understand that fully. And that means they need to actually start reading and learning from the, documented experiences of other people. So don't corner a Black woman that read what's already been written and said, learn how that system works. And then you need to find your place in it. And you need to find where you've been upholding it and where you have power to make change in the system, in your communities, with your power and flex it. I get really frustrated when, you should never be the hero of this story. If you're doing your work right as a white male ally, we're not encountering you a lot because your work that you need to be doing is in your boardrooms, in your meetings with your buddies, in how you're spending your money and how you're voting, that your work is going to be done in your sphere where you have access and power. If you are constantly coming back to us and we're aware of what you're doing and what's working, what's not, like chances are you're not doing the work in the right spot. You're just taking up space. And so you won't be the hero of the story if you're constantly coming back and people are saying, oh, I read what if you have Black women being like, oh, yeah, it's what you wrote, like, why are you marketing it to us? Like, we're good. You need to be in your space and doing that work. And we'll feel it. We'll see it in the systems. We'll see it when we have more access. We'll see it when we actually can go into these spaces, when we're pulled into these spaces, where we have power within them, or where the spaces themselves change, then we'll see the work. But you won't be the hero of the story if you're doing it right.
Right.
You'll be a bit player doing your part in the background.
Right. Don't center yourself. Don't expect credit. Don't expect to be exempt from scrutiny or critique yourself from
Mhm.
those you are purportedly being an ally to. And these are things I always try to be mindful of myself as, a cisgender
Mhm.
male who has a fair amount of residual white privilege. It's you're always going to get 10 times the credit for saying something that other groups have been saying on their own behalf for generations. So
Mhm.
resisting that impulse. And I mean, to me, I think even becoming attached to the notion of allyship, I'd rather just try to do the work and be a part of the solution
Mhm.
without even becoming attached to that concept.
Absolutely. And you don't get to define yourself as that.
Exactly.
Allyship is an action, and it's defined by the people that you're allied with, and it can be revoked at any time. And I think it's important to recognize that.
Hmm. And let me see. I had another one. Let me see. So it may be too soon to answer this, but have any mediocre white men given feedback on the book yet? And if so, what has it been like?
Oh, they're not reading my book. Hilarious. That's so funny. No, there's like one weirdo who keeps sending me multiple Word documents that he's written in response to an interview I gave, and hoping that I will read them and engage him. And I'm not gonna do that. I haven't opened a single one of them. Um, he seems to be putting a lot of work into them. One guy just sent me a message today saying, "Do I hate you as much as you think you do? Probably, but you're intriguing. Let's talk." No, maybe not. And so, but for the most part, they don't. I've learned that there's nothing worse than to slightly inconvenience a white man. So it's not my book because they're just not buying it. It will be if I show up on a news station that they're used to not seeing me on, or something like that, or if I tweet something that hits them. A lot of people thought for sure, especially with the title of the book, it was just going to bring this onslaught, and I was like, yeah, I think that's it's not usually how it works. It'll be an interview I give somewhere, or it'll be another tweet about Cracker Barrel I make, or something like that. That whatever it is that just inconveniences a mediocre white man where he is, and where he is not is where I'm hanging out. Is going to be the thing that brings the hatred to my door. So I can never predict it. We just got doxxed again a couple weeks ago, and it was because I shared support for this white sci-fi writer that has nothing to do with anything, and they don't even know who I am, but they were mad about that. It's just random.
And I won't spoil it, but there's a section towards the end of the book where you talk about what I would call the final form of that email from a white guy. That is mind blowing to me how far that sort of grievance will be taken.
It's just and I think we're seeing part of that now, right? We're seeing this kind of desperation, what it means to think like you have nothing else and you will tear
That's
everything
yeah.
down
This is
rather
the
than
story.
just.
What we're watching play out is a story of desperation. It's the last gasp effort to hold on to this fantasy of white male supremacy as it becomes harder and harder to maintain a grip on it. And
Mhm.
I mean, I guess the question is there a rock bottom where,
Right.
where they realize that they're being hurt more
I
than
know
they
I
help
know, I'm like,
cling to it?
is there an intervention we have? We're like,
Right.
stop.
I was watching these documentaries about Nexium thinking, is there a way? Is there a point at which they would realize this Trump brand that they're wearing doesn't represent what they think it does?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think honestly, someone savvy is just going to come and repackage it for them. That's the thing is, I think this is vital. When people are justifiably angry at a system that is corrupt and doesn't serve them, which a lot of people are, but you deny people the truth as to what's happening and tell them they have no right to feel betrayed or upset with the system as it is, that anger and that resentment doesn't go away. It sits there and waits for someone to give you a place to put it. And as long as we refuse to have honest and open conversations about capitalism in this country, about the vagaries of our political system, and about our real history around race, gender, and class, and the exploitation of people over history, there will always be an opportunist like Donald Trump, like the Bundy brothers, who will come along and say, this is why you're angry. This is why you feel this way. And so even if you're hitting rock bottom, if we don't have that honest conversation of this is what actually is happening, and this is actually why you feel this, this is what's going on in this world, it's just a matter of time before someone else picks it up. And so even if Trump stops serving, it doesn't mean he's not special. There's going to be someone else just like him coming up and saying, oh, remember this? And they'll use the anger of this. They'll use, even if this fails, the defeat of this. Those feelings of defeat and the feelings like you have nothing else to do, nowhere else to go. They'll use that to stoke a new, hatred and a new populism that's built on, violence and oppression.
I was trying while you spoke to find the James Baldwin quote about this, but he has one of his famous quotes is about until white people recognize what whiteness does to them, we are lost.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I think Dr. King had said something similar of like white supremacy has to be untenable to white people before it goes away.
Right.
And and that's the thing is we have to actually talk about it and have real conversations. But that means we have to want people to care about things that aren't power defined by the oppression of other people. And that's really, that's a whole nother discussion.
So, keeping that thought in mind that there will be another Trump, there will be someone else who packages this myth, and they may well be more adroit, more strategic, more of sound mind than Donald Trump was. The next time we have to deal with the next wave, I'll leave this as the last word. What, other than going to an independent bookseller and picking up the book Mediocre, what can we draw from the book, and what can we be doing to be better prepared for when that next wave of white male supremacy comes?
One is we have to actually start building in systemic protections of populations that are vulnerable to this anger, right? We have to limit the power that this anger has. And so we have to be talking about what does it mean to protect immigrant populations, to protect people of color? What does it mean to, honestly look at policing and, look at mass incarceration? What does it mean to go into our schools and look at the, the differing levels of education we have? Actually shoring up these areas and saying, we're going to take the systemic power away from violent white male supremacy and limit what it can do, and also empower people who aren't that. It's also really important that we build pathways to empower people who think differently, right? That we say, instead of saying, no, let's meet it halfway and disempower people who stand in opposition, say, no, we're actually going to beef it up. We're going to throw all our support behind people who stand in opposition of this and who offer a new and better way. And we're going to build forward. It's not just about preventing the worst from happening. It's about building forward. I think it's also really, really, really important, that we recognize how dangerous it is to let these false narratives of white male victimhood continue. And that part of how we disempower this and stop it from gaining steam, why it's so powerful right now, is because we spent so many years going, oh, but this is a valid, this white supremacy is valid. Let's talk about it. Let's debate it. Let's debate these neo-Nazis who are marching on, streets. Let's debate this violence. And instead of saying, no, this isn't valid because it doesn't actually lie in real history. These aren't real grievances. Black people really didn't steal things from you. Jewish people didn't steal anything from you. And we're not going to entertain it. We're going to have real conversations based on reality. And it's like, we should have social, political, and economic consequences for, the ways in which people stoke violence and stoke violent narratives. And so we need to recognize the real violence of that. We have to stop treating, the internet and chat rooms like they aren't real spaces that lead to real consequences. People are shocked and say, how is this? Like, have you been in any of these chat rooms? Because if you did for a minute, you wouldn't be shocked by anything you're seeing on the Capitol. You wouldn't be shocked by, I wasn't shocked when we were swatted at all, because I've seen the chat rooms, I've seen the discussions, right? I've seen what people would want to do in worse, so recognize that, take it seriously, talk about what we're normalizing, but also look at systemically how we can disempower the people who want to bring violence and want to subjugate others, and empower people who want to build a new future. So that means look at it in your schools. It matters everywhere. It matters in your schools, in your school boards, matters in your city council meetings, matters in your meeting rooms. It matters in how you spend your money, in what media you support, what you purchase. You know, all of that matters. Start paying attention, find a spot, and then share that information of what you're doing with other people so that they can join you.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me, with us this evening. It's been a blessing to be able to build with you in the midst of all this madness. And I hope people will go out and find the book Mediocre: The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. And I want to thank the Center for Brooklyn History for making this possible. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thank you to all the people of Georgia. Once again, much love to everyone out in DC. I hope you all stay safe. And hopefully we will see each other on the other side of this and then keep on pushing. Thank you again, Ijeoma.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Jay.